So yeah, let's actually just start things off. So one of the topics, as I said before, that we are going to be discussing today is the idea of meaningful design. And let me actually just read out what Cece said in the suggestions thread, just to make sure that you guys understand the nuance of what she's trying to learn about. So Cece says, hey, I'm totally in right now, and what I'm struggling with the most is design. How to make smart use of your references to reinvent your subject without copying too much what you're seeing. How to have more intent in designing shapes for an image. In relation to composition, for example, the latter is a big topic that is hard to teach, and even with the reading material I've digged in, I can't quite grasp how to change my habits composition-wise. So I think that's a two-part question, but I do think that the overarching question that she has is how to make more meaningful designs and how to make more use out of your reference to kind of come up with something that's more full of intent. So does anyone want to start off the discussion with what their thoughts of what a meaningful or design with intent actually means for them?
I would think that coming up with a design that, well, you need to think about what you're designing, right? What's the theme? What's the thing you're designing? So if it's going to be a character, where's the character from and what do they do? And then trying to understand the function behind the design, and then creating something that's visually pleasing out of that design. That's one way to approach it, I think, which I commonly tend to do over and over. What do you think, Axel?
Yeah, I would agree. I feel like when it comes to design in general, it should be pretty much purpose-oriented. Basically figuring out, why are you actually doing it? Why are you putting marks onto the canvas or on paper? Because even though it might be fun to just draw whatever, it's especially in a work environment, like all the time, there's a reason why you got to do this character now. It might just, and then there are like different like purposes that basically influence each other. And it's basically, all right, asking yourself, what's the character for? And then who is the character? And where's the character come from? What is the character supposed to do in the project, for example, and so on. And that kind of leads you down a path where it's quite intuitive what you actually need to design and what shapes you need to use.
I do agree with that. And that's actually what I wrote down in my own notes for this discussion, is that I think when people think about what makes a good design, I think design people think usually when they think of design, it's usually just, what do you call it? It's more like the visual aspect of things. It's like when they think that something is visually appealing, they say, oh, that's a really nice design. But I would argue that what makes a good design is that design's ability to solve a certain problem or address a certain purpose. So for example, you could have a character that looks really visually appealing. Let's just say a character design that you've done in maybe a very stylized character that you've done. It might look great, but as Axel and Mathias said, like if you think about the project, let's just say you're designing for Bloodborne or like Dark Souls, then all of a sudden it's not a very good design because it's not something you can actually use in the production.
Well, to be honest, a lot of Bloodborne and Dark Souls designs are actually quite appealing, don't you think?
Yes, as in like very stylized shapes. Let's just say like.
You think about like you wouldn't have like a very cute anime-looking character from Twitter, and then like, hey, here's a Bloodborne character.
But I think
it wouldn't quite make sense.
Yeah, but I think it's more like the a mix of first you gotta have the purpose and the function down, and then add to it a certain level of appeal. Because if it's an ugly design, but it ticks all the boxes of functionality and basically doing what it's supposed to do, but it's still not appealing, then it might just work to a certain degree and not as well as if it was also appealing.
Mm-hmm.
While appeal obviously is very can be a lot of things. I mean, Bloodborne characters can be appealing by being, even though they're completely ugly and disgusting characters, but from an artistic point of view, they can be appealing.
Exactly. I do think context is actually a very important thing. Like, I do think a design in a vacuum, it can have its own purpose. And sometimes what makes a design appealing, in my opinion, is just the story that we, extrapolate from it. Like, sometimes you'll get comments on artwork saying that, oh, I'm imagining this would work so great for a game. Or I would love to play a game that's designed with this kind of style. Like, people start building their own stories around it.
So that's always a good
that's
sign.
Really cool.
Yeah, that's always a good sign if people start wondering or basically spinning their own stories. It's like, you kind of hit a mark there.
Yeah. But I think from what I'm getting, though, from CC's question, it's more about, like, how do I come up with, like, let's just say if you're working a project, and let's just say you want to create a good portfolio piece that shows off your design skills, then I think one of the best ways to approach it is to set a very specific problem. Because if a good design solves a problem very well, then the best way to start or to eventually lead to a good design is to come up with a very specific problem, in my opinion, or a well-defined problem. What do you think of that?
I feel like that's not really usable for someone who wants to create a portfolio project or piece, showing off their design skills. I mean, Zurlin just shared Carlyn Lim's take on her design process. And I feel like basically in her portfolio you kind of there are a couple of posts where there are like groups of characters that she designs. So she seems to be a lot more project oriented. So basically, even though you might not work in the industry at the moment, you can think of, all right, I'm gonna when it comes to characters, for example, I'm gonna design a group of characters that belong together. And if you like, you can obviously spin a world around it, but don't make it too complicated. Just simple. Last year there was like the King Arthur challenge. That's a good start, where you basically take existing characters, a group of characters, and redesign them, giving them your own spin. So telling a little bit of your own story, or warping the story to how you like it, and that obviously then informs the design decisions that you make. And by making it a little project, you can basically show you being consistent, for example, when it comes to designs within a group. And that is something that clients are going to look for. That basically, can you actually properly think a design through? That it's not just one standalone, but it's like 5 characters, and it's easier to then show, hey, I actually thought about the design in showing it within 5 characters rather than just in 1 or 2, if that makes sense.
Yes, I mean, I agree with that. I do think that creating a project is the best way to show consistency, which is one factor if you're building a portfolio. But what if the goal of the portfolio is actually to show off your design abilities? How do you think would be best to approach it? Because you can very easily create consistent but very derivative character designs.
I think
that might not have much value to them.
The thing is that a lot of, from what I've heard over and over again from art directors and other artists, but especially people who are hiring, they want to see ideas. They want to see you come up with sketches and ideas for them. A lot of people come up with these very flashy, high rendered looking pieces in their portfolio, which is cool and all. That's really great for production. But for pre-production and coming up with ideas that people can use, they want to see hundreds and hundreds of sketches with good design. They don't want to see one good design. Okay, they want to see you make hundreds of different iterations of one character, creature, or different types of characters. And all of those things consist of a big fat chunk of visual library that you have in your head, as well as references that they've gathered for yourself. Looking through the question over again, it's okay to directly copy from the reference, and then you can also interpret the reference. Like, you don't directly copy the shapes or the composition from reference. You take like elements from it that you like. Like, for example, I like the color, or I like the shapes here, but I'll apply different types of color, or I do it in a different angle, but I'll take this I don't know, shoulder pad from this guy and put it on here, for example. Like, there are no rules, and that's where creativity comes in, that somebody in the chat was asking. That's what I would say is creativity, because you're actually looking outside the box, because you're not confined into this limited idea of, this is how you do this, I need to keep in this strict regime, this type of step-by-step process. It doesn't have to be like that. You can twist things around. That's why you want to experiment and come up with lots of sketches.
Especially because there isn't like some council of grandmaster concept artists who determine this is a good design, this is a bad design. As long as the design gets its job done, it fulfills its purpose. So kind of I think it might actually be a good idea to kind of get rid of the idea of creating a perfect design and just putting out ideas.
Exactly, because it's going to almost come out. It's really hard to intentionally make one good design.
Yeah, exactly.
You're just gonna have to make tons of sketches, man, which is like between 5 to 15 minutes long each, and then you pick out the ones you think is best, and then you take that one.
Exactly, and basically the big arbiter of truth is your taste, really.
Yeah, pretty much. Exactly. Taste is a big one, because I've seen so many times where people are gushing over a piece of art. I guess you could say, in a general aspect, this one is like, one piece of art is more valued than another. But again, there's still going to be people who's going to say, oh, well, I like this one more than that one, for example.
I think I do agree with all of that, but there's a specific reason why I think to come up with an actually good design, like talking about design in the frame of problem solving, it really is important to actually define what the problem is, even if it is a personal project. Like, for example, going back to your example of the King Arthur redesign project, if you've set out a brief for yourself, I want to redesign King Arthur. Okay, that's the one initial problem that you have to solve. But then maybe the second problem you have to solve is that, okay, there is a risk that I will come up with something derivative and something that has already been done and it's very generic. So your problem is, okay, how do I now come up with a unique design?
Well, I think if we stick to the King Arthur thing, is the big problem is, all right, I need to basically tell the story of King Arthur, or basically tell this character's story, or whatever I want to tell to the audience through the visual language. And basically, when it comes to originality or something that hasn't really done before, it doesn't really have to do with like, first and foremost, this is not the abstract idea of design. It's more like, all right, what ideas do you put into, or do you merge with the archetype of King Arthur, for example?
Exactly. I mean, that to me is a way of actually solving that problem of coming up with
something unique. And then it's really just, all right, it's you basically give it your own spin, and additional to that, obviously, the execution makes it very round and appealing. So the originality comes from your ideas, from your take, from what angle you actually look at the classic story, and then the appeal comes obviously, if it's a good idea, or if it's like an appealing idea. or an intriguing idea, but then also obviously the execution is anatomy right, or is the stylization appealing, colors, values, all that funny things that we learn through the fundamentals and through daily practice. Yeah, and then it's basically good at design. Yeah, you tell a story, people are moved by it. There's feeling that's conveyed. There's story that's conveyed. It's nice to look at, or it's interesting to look at. And what else do you need? That's it.
Yeah. If I was going to follow that thought process, so as I said, like if you set a problem for yourself, saying that, okay, if we're still going through with the frame of problem solving, the problem is I want to come up with a unique design. For me, what I would follow that up with is by saying, you have to set yourself certain parameters, because I think what makes it so overwhelming for people when they design, especially when they haven't really found out what their specific tastes are, is actually the being overwhelmed by the infinite possibility that you can choose anything, because the way that you approach this redesign can be anything. Like, for example, you make King Arthur set in Japan, for example, and even the style, for example, you can make it realistic, you can make it stylized. So I think sometimes by actually setting some parameters, you could actually come up with a more specific design and actually kind of remove that feeling of being overwhelmed, and it narrows your focus down to a certain area. And even within that area, there's still so much to explore within. Like, even if I told you that, okay, all of us in this chat right now, we're gonna redesign King Arthur set in medieval feudal Japan, I'm sure every one of us will come up with something different. But even then, I think just rounding it down for ourselves would already at least kind of narrow our focus down towards finding the appropriate reference for it.
I mean, so basically the problem I see there is what you mentioned. If someone hasn't really developed a mature, or not mature, but a sense for aesthetic, for style, for vision, or hasn't really learned to combine things in an interesting or meaningful way. A cool way to practice, to basically just get the foot into the door, is to see, all right, what if we stay with character design now, we can obviously do the same with hard surface, with props, with environments, with architecture, whatever. But basically, you usually, if you're motivated to do character design, it's mostly because you've seen another artist who does really, really great characters, right?
Yes.
So, well, then if you're overwhelmed and don't know where to start, start with what inspires you and try to dissect what the artist that inspires you does, and try to learn their style, or just copy some of it, as a practice, and try to translate how they do things into a new subject matter. So it's basically you just acquire their style, and then you move on to the next artist. And acquire their style, and all of a sudden, because you can't be a carbon copy of an artist, that's unhealthy, that won't work, you'd be just a cheap knockoff. But by looking at artists that you admire, looking at it doesn't even have to be painters or drawers. It can actually be photographers, movie makers, or whatever. So with time, your basically your art mentors or your inspirations seem to merge into fields that don't really have to do with art so much. But what happens is you take on some of what you learned from this artist that you admire, and it merges with what you have innate in yourself, in your own taste, your own experiences. You merge it with starts to merge with other artists that you study from, that you learn, and over time, you seem to almost get an intuitive sense for design and sense for solving problems. So I think that would be a start to very practically learn good design.
Can I ask a question on that?
Sorry, go on.
Oh, sorry. Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure.
Yeah, sorry. There's a lot of people talking at once, but basically, so yeah, that was a really good point right there. Let's say like you kind of have that going on, and let's say you have an idea that you want to execute that seems like a feasible thing with the skills you have. Like an issue I've experienced before is like I have an idea, I kind of have something I want to put a spin on, but the issue is my visual library isn't that extensive, so it's hard for me to kind of draw what I envision, and then finding reference for something super specific, like maybe proper attire for like feudal Japan armor, like might be something difficult. So it's like hard to how would you work within like the limits of your visual library to make something that's still visually appealing until you've gotten that built up?
Answer this? Yeah. So a good way is that you won't always find the perfect reference. That you just will never find that perfect reference. You will find references that are really good, and you might even find reference that you might have not thought that you would have looked for. That you might have seen some references that, hey, this is actually really cool, I want to use this one. But what you can do if you don't have a reference that you want, this is the kind of problem that concept artists need to figure out, is that, yeah, our job is to actually find things that doesn't even exist at times. And that is to actually kind of wing it and come up with ideas that are kind of, if you can kind of see the idea that you have in your head and you sketch it out, you come up with 10, 12, 20, 30 different sketches, and then you take the one that was closest to what you had in your head. Obviously, you said your visual library is limited. You suck in as much as you can by observing through your references. You can even study them. Like, have your references on the side, sketch what you have in mind that you want to come out with whilst looking at your references so that they come kind of close. Then also try and come up with stuff from pure imagination so that you can make it intuitive. It's ingrained into your head. You know how to make armor from your imagination, but it's always useful to have a bit of references on the side. And it's okay to, I guess, mutate and kind of do like a Frankenstein kind of idea of a sketch where you merge different references together and take elements from one reference of armor and another reference of armor. You can do that from like 10 different references. And you can get a unique design out of that. Even if you can't find the so-called perfect reference, because as I will say, you will never find the perfect reference. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
I think it's actually an interesting point that you bring up, Mathias, which is like the problem of coming up with something that doesn't exist. And it can be very difficult depending on the brief that's set out before us. And once again, I think that's why it's so important to actually define exactly what we're trying to design, even if it is our own personal project. Like, for example, a lot of my personal projects have come from a very specific idea that I wanted to come up with. So one of my most recent ones is the Hippo Temple. So even with that Hippo Temple, I set out some specific parameters to it. So I wanted it to have a specific cultural influence. So Thai and Indian. And it has to deal with the elements of water and mostly in the form of bubbles. And I want to make sure that the motif of hippos comes up with it. And in the end, on a more technical level, I want to make it feel like a believable level design. And I want to show anyone that's looking at my portfolio that I have put in a lot of thought on how I want this level to work. So that I can communicate that, hey, I can come up with some ideas. So with those things in mind, and since a water hippo temple doesn't actually exist in real life, I had to actually break it down in terms of how I actually can communicate that.
But to be honest, even though a water hippo temple might not exist in real life, hippos do exist in real life. Water and temples do as well. So a lot of the time, it's not you gotta create something completely out of thin air. It's like, all right, you gotta design this weird alien creature that we don't know how it's not supposed to look like anything on Earth. It's like, all right, this is almost impossible to pull off. To make something then that is perhaps you can pull it off, but it's not going to be liked by anyone because there's no relatability in there. So it's a lot of the time it's combining two things that haven't been combined, or that combine things that have been combined before, but do it in your own way. And
it's like pseudo originality.
Exactly. Well, but it comes back to the whole idea of, all right, there isn't actually anything really original.
Technically not, no.
It's all just one big reference.
But it is as it is. Humans, like, whether you want to believe it or not, we are always influenced by things from the outside, from outside of our head.
Oh yeah.
Like, even when you were born, you were observing things. Everything you're creating are influenced from sources from the outside. And that's why I'm saying that observing and sucking in information is key. I think that's super important if you want to learn and strengthen and broaden your visual library.
Yeah. But I feel like most of the time, like the majority, like a big portion of your experience is not going to be vastly different to someone else in a similar situation as you, or someone else who lives in a similar area than you. It's basically the human experience is quite similar mostly, and just varies slightly from person to person, doesn't it?
But I also find it interesting that we are so attracted to different cultures because we see things that we're not used to.
Yeah, that's true.
For other humans, because they live in a different area, they will have observed things from a different angle.
Everyone has their own superstitions, beliefs. Like, for example, one flower could have a positive meaning in one culture, and one could have a very negative meaning.
For example, in the Western cultures, white is considered pure and healthy and holy. But in China, the color white is considered something from. It's considered, or it's tied to death, basically, and it's tied to the underworld. But black is considered something a little bit more pure. I think.
Yeah, I think that's actually something to consider. Anyways, but I do think that's a little bit of a different rabbit hole. But it is actually, no, in a sense, it is a different rabbit hole. But there's actually something that I would like to touch upon, and something that I wrote down in my notes as well. And that when analyzing references, there's two frames. There's a few different frames you can analyze it, but I do think two very important ones to view it through is the frame of emotions and function. At least that's how I do it. And let me know what you guys think, but this is how I do it. So emotional, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, how, for example, one color or even one flower can mean completely different things in different worlds. In different cultures. So it doesn't functionally mean that, like, just because I have like a white flower, for example, it doesn't mean that it'll inflict death upon you in terms of its functionality. But at least in terms of emotion, like, for example, if you have a black rose in a movie, typically it's synonymous with death, I guess. Or like a rose would typically be synonymous with passion. So that's something that you can say you can inject into your design. Maybe you're creating a character and you want it to be like a very passionate character somehow. Maybe you can take a rose and take a part of the rose, which is the rose petals, and actually use it as a motif in your design, for example. Whereas in terms of a functional purpose, there are some items that I think when we see a silhouette of, we already know what it's designed to do. And as a result, it also carries its own emotional connotation as well. So I think items such as swords, for example, or if we see spikes, for example, those
Sonic the Hedgehog.
Yeah, well, yeah. I would say that's more. I think has a lot of like emotional baggage attached to Sonic now, depending on which person you ask.
Nothing personal, kid.
Yeah, nothing personal. But yeah, so like when it comes to spikes, for example, we can maybe think of danger, or maybe we even think about defense, because maybe people put on spikes as a form of a defensive mechanism, whether it's like on barricades or maybe it's on creatures themselves. So that in itself has a functional purpose, and especially for a more well-known and culturally, I guess, prevalent item, I do think it then as a result carries its own emotional connotation to it as well. Whereas some things we might not know, but we know it's like functionally relevant, at least to what our design is. But I think by actually distinguishing both of them, we can actually touch upon what we talked about earlier, which is creativity. How instead of, for example, if we want to create a dangerous looking knight, so instead of just drawing a knight full of spikes, maybe we can even dig deeper. So we can dip our toes into the emotional column, where maybe, okay, what else is dangerous, but not necessarily related to knights? So for example, maybe you want to take inspiration from animals or nature, which is, I think, a really great way, a really great influence to draw upon. And let's just say you decide to draw influence from a spider, a redback spider. So maybe you take some of the design motifs from the spider and implement it into the armor, or maybe even the color scheme is the only thing that you take away from it. But whatever you choose to do, that's actually one way you can actually add.
I saw a dude who made night designs out of poison mushrooms.
Oh, there we go. That sounds really cool already.
Yeah, and he actually managed to convey sort of like the design language of the poison mushroom. And I kind of looked at it and I looked super badass. And it kind of had that kind of feel that, hey, I don't really want to get too close to this type of person.
Yeah, exactly, dude. And we don't necessarily have to have a deep understanding of it. Like, there's certain things that you look at, you might not know why, but you feel a certain way from looking at it. And I think that's like different nuances. There's some that are so obvious that it's kind of like hitting you over the head with a hammer. But in my opinion, what makes a good design is actually ones that you can kind of keep on peeling the layers back and you always find something new about it. Whereas a shallow design, in my opinion, is one where you're like, okay, it's an armor that looks a bit spiky. Okay, it looks dangerous. But then when you look beyond it, it's like, okay, it's just a spiky knight, and that's about it. Okay, I'm gonna move on from this design. Whereas the ones that I feel like I really enjoy is that when I actually look at the design more and maybe even learn more about what has influenced the artist, I'm like, oh, so okay, no wonder this design resonates with me even more. Or it's like, oh, I never noticed that detail, but now it makes sense. And that's, in my opinion, like when a design gets when I get really excited about a design.
Yeah.
And I'll actually read out what Xylin has typed out. So Xylin says, there was also this point about strange and familiar parts in a design. It needs to be a bit of both, because people like recognizing things they know remixed into something fresh. If it's 100% unique, no one can relate. Exactly. So I think that's why references are such an important thing, and actually to draw upon what has been established and kind of like riding on the backs of what has been established culturally and even through evolution, something that's so innate within us, and just learning to implement that into our designs.
A lot of people, you often see these cliches in art too, that if you kind of come up with something that people aren't normally used to see, you know, we all know people who draw orcs and goblins.
Yeah.
Or like the typical cop sci-fi with the cool gun. Or the big teenage sci-fi girl with the motorcycle or something. You know, all of those things are kind of very predictable. And people have seen it because they're kind of like the cliches of the arts world.
I think.
But you can.
Go on. Sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to think like it's okay to just go outside the box and go further.
Yeah.
Like you can just think of I don't know. We can think of an American baker in New York set in like the year 2050. How would that look like in your
That's also a knight.
That's also a knight.
Yeah.
Sure. You know, baker knight.
Red knight.
Red knight. Yeah, maybe his weapon's like giant baguette. And his shield's like giant bagel. I don't know. Anyways, but I do think you touched upon something very interesting. And sometimes I think in trying to define creativity, that's a lot more difficult. But I think in trying to define what we think is non-creative, I think it's a lot easier to get at the point of like what the opposite of that could mean. So for example, non-creativity, as you said, Mathias, just now, is like something that's predictable, something that you've seen a lot. So it's like something that, it's like, yeah, I've seen this before. So you're not going to call it creative. And what Xylin said as well, there's sometimes that touch of unfamiliarity that could make someone say that, oh yeah, I never thought about that. Or it's like, oh yeah, I've never seen that before. That's really cool and creative. Like you said, maybe using like a poisonous mushroom as part of the influence for the armor, you know. So maybe
this
like
also.
Yep.
Yeah, sorry for interrupting, but I also want to point out that artists that have kind of coined their own creativity, but they continue to using that same idea over and over. I'm not going to say any names, but you sometimes see artists that you start following and you might have gone, whoa, I haven't seen this before. I'm going to follow this guy. And then 2 years later, they still do the same thing. And then again, it's predictable.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think that once you kind of milk something a lot or use it over and over again, it no longer becomes creative. And I think that is a big issue.
I think part of being a creative is also reinventing yourself over and over again. It's the moment you basically figured out something, it's basically time to move on to something that you haven't figured out yet. You came up or you developed a way to design characters that works for you perfectly and it's wonderful and you have fun. And it's basically, that's the sign. All right, you gotta find something new, different approach, different subject matter, different area of art altogether to keep yourself fresh and to keep yourself from treading the same path or standing still.
Yeah, exactly. I completely agree with that. And I've also written down a couple other things, but I think one interesting way to reframe this, the way that we are answering this question without actually straying too far from the original question, is that let's just say right now we're tasked to design something. Let's just say, once again, a knight. So something very generic or something that's common. How would you guys approach it if you were to make smart, so once again to quote what CCS wrote, how to make smart use of the references to reinvent your subject matter without copying too much of what you're seeing, and how to have more intent in designing shapes for an image. Like, how would you guys actually concretely approach this? Like, if you had to share your process with someone so that they can follow along with it.
Do you want to answer first, Axel, or shall I go?
I don't mind.
Okay, and I'll start. For example, I don't think I've done a whole lot of nights, surprisingly, but I've seen so much of it, and I already know what it's all about. So already kind of creating a night sounds a little bit boring to me, you know?
Okay,
But that's blasphemy because I've seen it.
if you can think of another example, that's fine. It's just like one of the first things.
No,
that
I'm going to continue with it because this is where the creativity thing comes in. I'm not saying that I'm creative or anything, but
I'm not saying that I'm working or anything, but bullshit.
But to give a spin on the night idea, I would write what I like to do, and this is personal because we all have our own personal process. And for me, it would to either take some notes or create a mind map. You know, so I can go deep into like a big project, or I can make it into something small. And let's say if I'm just going to make it into something small and easy and bite-sized, right? So I kind of think, all right, night, that's kind of cool. Let's kind of play around with. I don't want to kind of go the classical historical medieval type of night, nor do I really want that sort of typical fantasy night with the huge pauldrons, but I do like that shape language that they use in fantasy, so I'll keep that at least. And then let's think of a world. Let's kind of think of a sci-fi night instead. That is kind of has an inspiration from, I don't know, Second World War Russian experiment. That's kind of crazy. Let's look at some references for that. And maybe it's a night that specializes in gassing, like gassing people. Maybe it's like mustard gas or some crazy shit like that. And then I tried to come up with something where it's like a kind of like a steampunk, sci-fi looking night that uses gas as a weapon. You know, and I keep that as just like a little small project, and then I create a few sketches out of that, looking at artists that I find interesting to me. So let's say I think something that would fit very well with this project would be Maxim Verihin, which does very creepy looking characters. One of my top favorite artists is Rael Lira, so I take some inspiration from him in terms of rendering, in terms of line quality and shape design. And let's take some real life references from actual knights, from historical knights, to kind of make it resemble one. And then take some references from Second World War soldiers and maybe some doctors from at that time. And I'll play around with different ideas. Maybe one version of the knight looks a lot more classical looking. Another one looks very sci-fi looking. Another looks more like a mix of a doctor and a soldier. And I come up with all these different ideas, and this is how I explore and come up with outside of the idea, because the word knight is just one word for the prompt. You know, I can fill in the rest. Because if you say there has to be a knight in the 14th century that is from France, that's a lot more limiting, but I can still play around with that. You know, is it going to actually be from the real life world? It has to be from the real life world. Okay, that's going to be trickier to do. Then I'm more limited. But if you just say design a knight, then I can come up with anything.
Do you think those limitations are a good thing, though?
Depends. It honestly depends. It depends on yourself, and it depends on the project that you're going to do. I mean, if it's just for a personal project, you know, sure, you can play around and see what you can do with those limitations, because technically the limitations are, the imagination is limitless. It's just your imagination, your own imagination, which you're limited by, and what you choose. But let's say if you're working for a client, obviously that's going to be a lot more limited because the client has his own vision. But I'm talking in terms of personal projects, right? I like, but this is where the notes come in, right?
Yeah.
When you have a prompt, and then I try to funnel all of my own ideas when I create notes. So I have limited a little sort of like circle for myself that I can explore in. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I like to do.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to a lot of the steps of your workflow. It's very similar to how I would approach things.
Yeah, same. I think what I would do differently though, is to think more really project based, because even though if someone tells me just design a knight, that is pretty much pointless. So basically, if I know what's the knight for, And usually in a work environment, the client comes to you and he has a very specific problem. He has a very specific world. He has very specific guidelines. And when you know all those points, those specific limitations, and then he tells you design a night, then all of a sudden things become a lot more streamlined. I mean, if it's basically a kind of sci-fi World War II Soviet night kind of character, the client, or even if it's just a personal piece, personal projects, you have kind of decided that beforehand. You've kind of, at least to some degree, set the limitations to, all right, diesel punk, night, alternate reality, you know, and then I would, again, similar to Mathias, write down notes or do a mind map, mostly just notes, just key points, and it doesn't really have to do. It can relate to the limitations of the projects, like the big keywords that were established in the beginning before I even started looking for references. And but then it's also, all right, what's a night? What do I associate with nights? Because if it's supposed to be a night, the viewer or someone who's going to experience the design later on should at least to some degree get that it is supposed to be a night.
Yes.
So you need to have like similarities that is, all right, people know this is a night. And then you can think, all right, what do I connect with nights? You can look up, research nights, research what are they all about. And perhaps you go and find something that is interesting that hasn't really been explored that much in recent pop culture, and you can put that in there as well. And then it's basically, if you already got some like visual ideas, I'd sketch them out. But then before going forward, I'd start gathering a mood board, references, and creating a mood board. Basically collecting things to all that relate to all the key points that I wrote down. So and basically while doing it, it can be references that I shoot myself, or references that I know, all right, I've experienced that before, or I've been to this and this museum and have seen these cool and unusual pieces of armor. Get that all in. Get things from Soviet times, war times, diesel punk, all the stuff that might relate to the project or just tangent it a little bit. And and then I would then start merging all those different visual ideas together and just sketch and put out lots of different ideas and and go from there. That's about it.
Awesome. You know, I find it very interesting that there's a lot of overlaps. It might not be exactly the same process, but there's similar steps that you two, and actually I would even say even with my own process, that we all share together. And I think it's very interesting that you even say that you draw from some of your own personal experiences, Axel, because a personal experience might not necessarily be universal, but I would even argue that there's a certain universality to even our own personal experiences, because it's still very human, and to a certain degree or another, I think we can relate to it. So even if we hear about another story about a person that has gone through some hardships, let's just say in a foreign country we've never heard of, we might not know the nuances of that culture, but we can at least relate to the aspect of hardships, you know. So and I think that could actually sometimes be the key to come up with something unique, is to actually inject some of your own personal experiences into something. And that's something that I do with my own personal work, is that when I'm creating environments, I draw back a lot from my own experiences traveling. I think back to the sights and sounds, and I think back to some of the interactions I've had with certain people, or maybe the feelings that I had when I first laid eyes on this magnificent monument or view that I witnessed during my travels. And I think being able to draw upon that could actually be one way that you kind of create a more immersive environment that you can beyond just looking at references. But also you talking about knowing the purpose as well, I think it's actually really important. And I think that's actually something very, really important. While maybe a client usually lays out all of these parameters for us, even when we're working on our own personal project, we can do it for ourselves. And that's why I asked Mathias early on, do you think it's important to set limitations? And I personally believe that it's very important to do so, because it, like as I've said earlier, it makes it less overwhelming for us. But at the same time, it just allows us to work within a certain frame, and really just focus the possibilities within that.
Well, it actually just allows you to solve a problem. If there isn't any limitations, where's the problem? You know, it's like nothing is defined. Everything is gray and weird and chaos.
When everything is possible, that is usually when we feel paralyzed. And that's why I think some people work so well under a client, because they don't have to set those limits. Some people have a problem with setting those limits for themselves. So as Axel and Mathias touched upon earlier, talking about, let's just say if you're making a knight that actually main weapon is a gas, then for example, you can start looking at functional references. So maybe you can look at gas canisters, and maybe you can even look at hot air balloons, for example. Maybe one thing that makes the knight really cool is that maybe on his back, you know, he has something that looks like a giant hot air balloon, or maybe he is like floating with a giant hot air balloon on his back, you know, so it's kind of like a blimp knight. So you see him kind of like underneath, you know, holding his giant tube that shoots out gas, and he's just flying over the air, gassing people.
Right. And the thing is, sometimes limitations can be really, really loosely defined. And then I feel like what Mathias said earlier really comes into place, where you just gotta shoot in all different directions. If it's a very, very loosely defined, if the limitations that you have are basically, all right, give us ideas, and all of a sudden, the focus shifts a little bit. It's still a form of problem solving, but all of a sudden the client or you yourself don't know what you actually want. So you gotta kind of figure out what you have, what you need to draw while drawing. Mm-hmm. So that is, I feel like, a different problem altogether. Where all right, it's not just a brief that you need to work on like a good little robot. No, you actually just start really like exploring, and I think quick sketches, even without references, but with references it's also fine, or just gathering all that juicy little information. It's really all things that you can tie to the topic, or that kind of seems to evolve out of you sketching and exploring certain shapes and ideas. And that way you can actually come up with really cool stuff that you haven't thought of before. Exactly. And it might just loosely tie to the original prompt, but it's still something that you can use.
Mm-hmm.
To add to that about limitations, a common, I think there's a term I heard used in the concept art industry is closing doors. That is that when you create a series of sketches, you pick two, like one or two of your favorite pieces of sketches, and then you take the one that, like all of them are very different, and then you pick one that you like the most, and then you kind of like create like children out of like those sketches that are like very similar to the original one that you chose. and then you choose one out of the new sketches that you like, and you keep funneling down. And whilst you're doing that, you're so-called closing the other doors of potential work, because you're really, and you're making sure that you don't go back to those other sketches, that you actually commit to the path towards the visual language and the style and sort of the look that you want for that thing.
Yeah, it's basically, it's the other way around, isn't it? Instead of kind of putting the limitations from outside by giving a more detailed brief, you limit yourself over time by figuring out through exploring what you actually want.
That's a very common way of how they do that in concept art. I was looking through the Hobbit concept art. They were making a lot of designs for the goblins, and they made like there were so many different variations. They took inspirations from spiders. They took inspirations from the goblin shark, the deep sea goblin shark, for example. They took inspiration from monkeys and apes. They took inspiration from rats. They took inspiration from bats. And then they kind of, I think they steered towards kind of like the monkey and bat more. And then they kind of made hundreds of sketches of that. And then they funneled it down to a certain sort of like wrinkly with warts, and they had like really light skin. And they kind of came to a conclusion after like series. They had these like sort of like generations of sketches that they had, that they sort of that they nitpicked out of, and they managed to funnel down in like a reverse pyramid scheme.
Yeah. So I think as it goes further down, when you're funneling, you're kind of, like you said, closing doors or eliminating other possibilities. And the more specific I think you become with your design.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very natural process when it comes to closing in on a design. And I think that sometimes we pressure ourselves too much by thinking, what's the perfect design? And I'm certainly a victim of that. I always think about, okay, how do I make the most compelling and most layered and complex design ever? But sometimes there's some jobs that's like, you know, does it tick all of these major keywords and points, as Axel mentioned in his process? Does it tick all of those boxes? And if it does, then the rest doesn't really matter as much. If you can make it more complex, great. But you have to have just like main keywords and criteria that you fulfill. And once it's done, you kind of just should move on. And yeah, that's an advice I need to take for myself, I think. Because I try to overcomplicate things sometimes.
Yeah.
But I also like to touch upon a little bit more about something that we talked about, like sometimes just thinking about what kind of influences we can put into our piece. And there's one great tip that I learned a while back, which is the idea of actually playing two stereotypes. So let's just say, going back to the topic of night, as Axel said, if we are to brainstorm about what we associate with nights, we'll probably think about, you know, helmet, and then like medieval, and then maybe jousting, so on and so forth. So that's some of the things that we can come up with. But from this diagram that I'm drawing, it's kind of like within this sphere of familiarity that a lot of people come to expect from the knights. And you can say it's still within the sphere of generic. However, the further away we go from that, you can say the more unfamiliar that it becomes. So maybe it's lesser known information. But sometimes by introducing something completely unexpected, like Mathias said earlier, it's a knight that actually sprays gas at people. That's something that people don't typically associate with knights. But at the same time, if we make it so foreign, then people are not going to recognize it. So sometimes we have to figure out, first of all, what the stereotypes are. But maybe there's a certain aspect of it that we've listed down that we can twist. So maybe some things we do keep. Let's just say we do want to keep the medieval aspect of it. We're going to keep that. And then, but the things we're going to change, for example, is the helmet and jousting. So instead of a jousting pole, maybe he could be holding like a giant, what do you call it? a giant spray gun that's shaped like a jousting pole, you know. So we're taking something familiar and then introducing something unfamiliar to it. And with the helmet, we can draw a more medieval looking helmet, let's just say. And then we introduce an unfamiliar element to it, where it's like a medieval helmet with a gas mask attached to it, for example. So by actually knowing like the stereotypes and choosing which ones to keep and which ones to bend, I think that's one way we can play to the strengths of those rather than trying to come up with something completely new and unfamiliar.
Yeah.
So I think that can sometimes just be a lot more, what do you call it, manageable for people to work with. Otherwise, if the task is come up with a completely new concept of night that no one has ever seen, then that's going to be a very high task. You can't beat all of the cultural connotations and also all of the things that we've grown to learn and associate with nights that's been built up over centuries or decades within just a few hours, you know. There's no chance in that. So that's what that's one tip that I learned a while back that has been very useful for me. So I think it also can be a good way to approach a design, and especially if you're starting off. I talked about this very briefly at one point. It's thinking about the ratio you want to keep and you want to change. So let's just say your reference is 100%. If you don't change anything, it's 100% of the ref, or you can say the stereotype or original. But then, what if you switch the reference, the ratio to 80% generic, and then 20% unexpected? So once again, that could be anything. Sometimes you can even surprise yourself by trying to cram two things that seem so crazy and unrelated. But bottom line is you're just going to change a little bit of it so that you're making your own job easier. Still making it recognizable, but at the same time have a part and point of it that's going to make audiences go, that's interesting. I've never seen that before.
Yeah.
And of course, the more experienced you are, the more you can change that ratio. Maybe it's 50-50 or 70-30 or whatever. But I do think that some part of it has to still remain grounded. Otherwise, it becomes too foreign.
I think something to keep in mind when it comes to, especially when someone is a beginner or hasn't really had a lot of experience when it comes to designing or art in general, learning about what you want to design is crucial to basically the design being believable or successful. If we stay with Night, you can obviously look up references, but if you don't have a decent understanding of how the type of armor that you kind of want to redesign or that you want to use, how that actually works, how it functions, how it moves, how it's built, or even how it's made, that obviously makes it a lot harder to design it deliberately and to basically put the 20% new stuff in there. You gotta start somewhere, and usually when it comes to learning design, it's actually learning how things work in real life, how things look like in real life, that you're gonna warp and change and upgrade later. I mean, it was actually for me the big thing that changed for me from not being able to draw any knightly characters or characters with armor was really my inability to not knowing how armor functions. So I had to actually sit down, look at armor, read about armor, and research and draw armor and
wear
draw
armor, make it from scratch.
Yeah, that'd be ideal, but I don't have the money for that. But you get the idea. It's the same with fashion. It's like if you want to design a new dress, you better know how dresses work, how the seams go, what kind of elements a dress usually has and how fabric flows on the body. It's like those basic things. It's like the next step from fundamentals where you learn how to depict things to how things actually function. Like a base understanding of the world needs to be there in order for you to design something on top of it.
Yeah. And I think that's the difference between, you can say, someone that is experienced in a subject matter and someone that isn't. It's just the fact that they know a lot more nuances, to the point that they know what rules they should keep, and what they can break as well.
Exactly.
But yeah, I think that covers quite a lot about design. But does anyone have any questions? And especially Cici, since you're the one that asked this question in the first place, does this address a lot of the problems that you're having, or do you have any other questions?
It does. What I was mostly struggling with when I tried to design an environment piece that I showed in the chat was mostly how to know what idea to invest in, and how do you know if the ideas that you're trying to combine are actually interesting and are worth pursuing? Because sometimes you feel like you come up with an original idea, but just because it hasn't been done doesn't mean that it has to be done. I mean, the fact that it hasn't been done kind of shows that maybe it's not a good idea in the first place. I don't know if it's clear, but like.
That's a good question, actually.
That comes back to the infinite possibilities and the infinite options that you have. You just pick the one that you like the most. Do you like it? Do you actually enjoy looking at it? Do you find that this is something that you feel, hey, I would actually look at this again and feel like, yeah, I'd actually enjoy it? Then sure, there's a good chance that other people will like it too.
Yeah.
And there's going to be maybe 5 other sketches that you think, hey, I think that these other sketches are cool too, but you kind of choose and pick the ones that you think is best right now. But, again, there won't be 100%. There's a percentage. It isn't quite like black and white, and it's going to be very difficult for you to choose, and that's when you just have to pick and choose the one that you like. But again, that's like that is one picture out of 100,000 more that you want to do in the future. Yeah. So it doesn't really matter. You just continue to make more art, and if you just consistently make art and show it to other people, it becomes kind of like a median. You will find a median of art that is good and consistent, and other people will find that too. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
That's a really good answer. I think I couldn't have put it any better. It's really, I think, just finding out what sticks and what doesn't, and sometimes actually showing ideas that you can say, quote unquote, that fail, that are a bit crazy or maybe doesn't resonate as much. It's fine, because not all ideas have to be great, but your value as a concept artist or visual development artist would be the ability to come up with ideas, even if they aren't always great. But the more that you come up with, and let's just say we all have bad ideas in us, and sometimes it takes us getting out all of those bad ideas until we reach a good one. And there's no way that we can get to that good one unless we get the bad ones out of the way. And as long as you kind of stick to that ratio that we were talking about earlier, like as long as you're kind of basing it off of something quite cool already, then most likely there's still some value to it. As long as like you, the references that you're using in themselves in isolation are like already something that is quite interesting, I don't think you can really make something that's that doesn't appeal to anyone, But hey, there's always that chance that sometimes it won't resonate with much people. But Mathias, I think, makes a really good point, is that as long as you really like it and not many other people do, that's fine. You still have other pieces that you can try to see what sticks to the wall, you know.
But I feel like that's the problem of every artist. It's like, yeah, no one knows what's the right thing to draw, what's the good idea, what's the bad idea. Just do as many ideas as you want or as you can, see what sticks, and then that's about it. I mean, it's the same with illustrations. Sometimes with illustrations, it's just purely telling stories visually. And you don't know if the story that you tell is even interesting. I mean, there's a reason that you tell the story, or else why would you paint it? It's like you have at least a tiny little bit of interest in it, and that should be reason enough.
Yeah. And I guess that's the whole thing, right? You'll never know. You just gotta throw it to the wall and see if it sticks.
Yeah, it's like every artist, even the big boys, everyone has this problem.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't stress about it.
Yeah. At the end, just experiment.
Generic ideas out. Yeah.
Sorry, would you mind repeating that, Cici?
I was just saying, so, like, for me being like a total beginner at this, designing specifically, it's almost like we have to get all of the like bad, like quote unquote bad ideas out before, like not necessarily bad ideas, but like the most generic ones that come to mind when you think of a certain subject matter, in order to then be able to do iterations that will have some sort of purpose in a like at the beginning, like from what I've seen, at least in my school environment, for example, like when we had to come up with a certain character design, for example, based on the topic, it was always very, very like so generic that it was it didn't have any purpose to it. It was just like, okay, I created a character because I had to create a character, but then like why is the character there in the first place? And I feel like it's like a struggle that like beginners have in general. It's like they draw, but they don't really have any intent.
Yeah. I think that's why both Mathias and Axel in their process say that it's important to know like what the world is, what the powers are, and basically specifying limitations and the purpose of this design. Because if you don't think about it, then it's very easy to just come up with either something generic or that you get overwhelmed with the possibilities, the infinite possibilities. I'm personally a really big fan of the quote of limitations breeds creativity. So knowing the limitations can actually, really allow you to come up with better solutions and designs, in my opinion. And it seems to be something that has been echoed by quite a few other artists as well, which is why I stole that quote. But I would say if you're a beginner in the sense of design, going back to ratio thing, try maybe like changing 5% of it, just a little bit, you know. Like if, once again, going back to the topic of medieval knights, maybe just change the fact that their shield is made out of, maybe made out plants or something like that. So you're changing
I feel
a
like
little bit of it.
One thing is we've been kind of focusing quite a lot on characters, but the same obviously is applied to environments or
props or vehicles.
Yeah, exactly.
Plants or trees, or it could be whatever.
Exactly. And then there's basically, all right, what do you want to show? What do you want to tell? What kind of feeling do you want to convey? These are basically the bare minimum of questions you should kind of ask yourself and answer before drawing something. If it's an environment with a mighty magical tree somewhere, it's like, all right, how do you convey that? How do you, okay, it's mighty, it's magical, it's a tree. it's an environment. So you make the composition in a way that the tree appears mighty and magical. And like really, this is like the simplest of the simplest things. And if you actually want to tell a story, so it's perhaps an environment focused illustration, then you might want to put characters in there that do things, that there's a story, or and so on and so forth. So it not always. We basically just take the character design as an example to explain the work process.
Yeah.
But amended, it basically applies to everything.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, just to make that clear.
And I think as far as simple, the most important questions to ask is the 5 W's is like who, what, when, where, why. If you can actually like lay down all of it, you'll most likely come up with something quite solid to work off of. So even when it comes to environment, it's not necessarily that you're designing the characters, but even just thinking about who are the people living here, you know, what is this place supposed to be, when, like what's the time period, you know, and then where. Maybe it's in a desert, it's in the Arctic or whatever, and why, most important.
Yeah.
So as long as you can answer those 5 questions, you'll most likely have a solid enough framework to really work within. So it applies to anything: characters, environments, vehicles. And it's some of the things that I was also taught in FZD is just thinking about these 5 W's. And I think it's very solid advice.
As concept artists, which goes for characters, environments, props, and whatnot, we kind of have to be storytellers. And storytelling is very important in concept art anyway, because that's what people most resonate with. You want to create a cool story or a good story that people get attached to or that they can enjoy, and then you want to create a cool design. You know, so you have the story part and you have the visual part, or like the visual clues are, or the story are in the visual clues. I mean, but yeah. So you have kind of like the theoretical elements, and then you have the functional elements.
Yeah, and that's why I was also dividing references, for example, between emotion and functionality. So I think those are 2 good frameworks to work within when it comes to looking for references. Yeah, I think that's quite a lot to take in, but I've been taking notes of this time and even doodling some little images to go along with the notes.
I actually have to reinvent this. I'm doing the one steer again tomorrow.
Yeah.
This week's creature, I guess, is Beholder. How the hell do I... Beholder is probably one of the more generic, but also most iconic designs. Like, how do I change that? So I'm coming up with different designs for Beholders.
That's interesting. Maybe it's like a blind beholder.
That would be a very useless one, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
But
That's not very
I'm coming
good
up with...
beholder.
Yeah, I'm coming up with like different designs. I can share them in the chat.
Yeah, that would be cool to see, man.
Right now, I shared a sketch.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions or maybe something else they want to share on this topic of design? Because I realized that we've covered quite a lot and a little bit of meandering, but I think near the end we managed to come up with something a little bit more concrete and applicable.
Yeah, I would agree. I feel like it has been a good summary of like the basic process of learning how to design and coming up with cool designs.
Yeah. I would
How
say
do
it's
you
tough.
come up with your own deadlines?
Because
you could like make new variations and iterations forever, basically.
Yeah. Oh, that's very true.
Feels like a personal attack. But yeah, if you guys wanna take that.
So what exactly is the question?
How long should you spend on each stage, or on?
Oh boy. That is actually I don't know if I can answer that because I'm really not good at giving myself good deadlines.
Same.
It's obviously super easy for work when the studio gives you, all right, you've got 1.5 days to do this and this and this, and then you gotta move on. Then you gotta have something to present, and you gotta move on to the next stage. But yeah, when it comes to personal stuff, for me, it's mostly, and that's actually something that I need to change a little bit. For me, it's really once I feel like, all right, this is far. So basically, if I start to get bored with a stage, I usually move on. It's not a great way to do things, I know, because it drags things on for ages. And it's way too perfectionistic. But yeah, that's what I usually do. I mean, recently I've been doing a couple of illustrations, and there it was really all right. The moment the story I want to convey within the illustration is clear enough, and all elements that need to be there to convey the story or feeling are established well enough for me to move on to paint it. That's basically like the cue for me. All right, you've figured out composition, you've figured out shape design and all. Let's paint this stuff now.
Sorry.
So yeah, it's a difficult one, especially when it comes to personal work.
Yeah, setting deadlines is good. I mean, I guess the thing that you need to focus on yourself, Axel, is like not being too precious about art. That's
No.
We talked about the other day, right?
Yeah.
And I guess it's kind of like the same here. You know, I also need to be a little more pragmatic with the choices I make and coming up with ideas and actually, because my process is kind of slow, right? And that's why I posted the beholders in the art hangout discussions, and I'm doing like these sketches that are like between 2 to 6 minutes long, and they don't take me that long. And then there's some a little bit more detailed to get me a better idea, and then I kind of pick and choose from there. Now, when it comes to having deadlines, I don't really have a deadline because I don't think I kind of do when I do personal art. I feel like I have a decent flow. I just do whatever, as long as when I do client work, that's deadline, that's enough for me. When I do personal work, I don't really care that much about how much time I spend, because I feel like I don't feel too pressured to just post things super quick all the time.
Yeah.
But that's just me. But if you feel like you want to gain some traction, say Instagram and ArtStation, all of those have different algorithms, but in Instagram it's preferred that you post a sketch at least once a day. Well, there you have it. You have your deadline. Produce a sketch or a series of sketches every single day. And I could do that too, but I don't feel too pressured to do that. Same thing goes for ArtStation. You should at least be posting one sketch once per week or every other week if you want to gain followers. And what I'm doing, for example, on ArtStation is that I'm taking my time with personal art, because I do work, I do freelance, I study, and then I also do personal work, and that's a lot of like time. And then added to that, I have other things to do during the day, so it's very tight for me to do work in my free time. But I have work stacked up, so I have a certain period on ArtStation when I can post things. So like when I'm prepared, I can post 4 pieces on my ArtStation, for example, 4 big projects every week, for example, and that will gain me a few followers, for example.
Yeah. I think for me, I'll just simply summarize it as depends on your purpose. Like if you're what you typically do is that you do very quick and rough sketches, then you'd probably benefit from doing longer exploration. And the inverse as well. If you're typically spending too long, maybe it'll be worthwhile doing some explorations that are timed like 30 minutes each. And by trying something different from what you normally do, that's when you kind of see the most improvements or breakthroughs.
Yeah.
And once again, depends on the purpose. But ultimately, having a deadline is important. Otherwise, you'll always run the risk of, oh, but I could do this, I could do that. So whatever it is, just do your best to stick with it. But if you don't, just ask yourself why you didn't and make adjustments if necessary, whether that be to your deadline or to how long you actually spend on something. And in my case, I'm in the category of never really having a limit, and I always just push an idea and never really getting down to it. But yeah, I'm working on that recently with the projects that I'm on, so that's good to have. It's a personal thing.
Yeah, I find it so with personal projects, it's like you get so enthusiastic, and then you do like a sheet of sketches and you build the base, and then you have a fresh idea and you just drop it, and like I just never revisit. There's like 5 projects which are just like could have been something cool, but I just constantly get distracted by a new thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I feel you. I actually feel like I have too many projects in my mind. I just I have like at least 4 different projects, and all of them are quite big. I'm like, I gotta pick one. I gotta pick at least one at a time, and that's what I need to do. So,
dude, I'm literally the same.
Yeah, so just what I would do is just pick one and hone on that one project and try not to deviate from that. And have fun with it. Come up with many different ideas, and then pick and choose the ones you like and spend time on like one piece. And you don't always have to do these massive projects. You can tone it down. I think one of the projects that I really enjoyed was the Fruit People projects I did with Thomas. And that was just 3 different characters that I did for it. And there was nothing more to it. And I had a lot of fun doing them. And I finished that project, no problem. I was short, sweet, and cool. So you could do something like that as well.
Perhaps basically having the goal of a project that you tackle is really, all right, the aim is to finish it. So basically don't make it too big and just force yourself to finish the project so you have at least something to post online. That's a good goal for yourself.
Yeah.
All right. If I have these 4 projects lined up, the one I'm at the moment most interested in, I'm gonna stick to it, and in the end, perhaps it's too big. I made it way bigger than I can tackle. Then cut it down and have something that at least looks finished to share. And yeah, it's a personal piece, personal projects, that is. And then then it's done. You can forget about it, because, well, if it's too big, if it's open-ended, you're never gonna finish it, because you have 10 other projects that are open-ended and too big lined up anyways. And you're gonna have 100 more projects open-ended, too big in the next couple of weeks. So no, just finish stuff, move on, finish the next. That's, I feel like, the way to go.
Yeah. Keep in mind that you're just one person.
Yeah.
There's no need to do a 20 man project when you're just one guy.
Yeah.
You can try, but you're probably going to spend 10 years working on it, and then you're going to realize, man, I've only done one project.
Yeah, but just imagine the dude that did Astartes. Huh?
Yeah, that's like an insane project, but that's a life commitment type project that he spent at least 5 years on now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you're still a beginner, I wouldn't commit so much time to it.
He has lots of experience. Like, that guy is a hardened expert. So
Yeah.
That's a different story. Yeah. Hardened criminal.
Yeah. Once again, it depends. Personal projects, I feel like to me, it's meant for growth and getting you closer towards your goals. And as you can probably tell from how I defined it, it's very personal. And I personally try and do things as different as I can to what I'm doing at work. Because at work, I have no choice over what I have to do, or very little choice. So for my personal projects, I try and make it different so I don't burn out, for example. But otherwise, if you're still not a professional yet, I do think personal projects are the best way to experiment. So change around these parameters, the deadlines, the briefs. Just find something that works for you in the end. I think that's the nice thing sometimes about not really having something super established yet. The fun part is actually figuring it out, in my opinion.
I would say I grew the most when I did personal projects.
Yeah.
Yes, same. Funnily enough, my portfolio right now is all personal work.
Same.
And I've gotten most of my job offers from personal work. Well, I guess you can say all of my job offers from personal work, outside of Adam Hawk, of course. So yeah, it can be a very important thing to really spend time on.
Awesome, thanks.
But yeah, I realized that we ended up spending the whole session just talking about design. So
yeah, that was another question, right?
The other one was like about color, applying it to things outside of environments. So I think that in itself is like quite a big topic.
Yeah.
But what does it mean by outside of environment?
So the question was asked by Kirokia.
I can speak on that, I guess.
Yeah, go ahead.
If you want. Yeah, I mean, I don't really know. Like, I mean, I don't even know what we would have talked about in terms of the discussion, but in terms of the value demo we had last week, I tried playing around with that, and then when I tried to deal with color, like, I mean, things got pretty complicated. And coming from a more traditional background, like limiting my color palette was helpful. But you know, with digital, there's so much you can do. So kind of just having a discussion on that, but I definitely don't think that's something to do today. But yeah, it was pretty broad. I didn't really have like a specific question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that one I think is quite challenging to answer. But we can reserve it for another time, because if we go on that, I think it'll be at least another hour. And I think this one has gone on for quite a while. 1.5 hours actually.
It's good.
Yeah.
It's good. I could talk all day about this, baby.
Yeah. And there's just so much to cover when it comes to these topics, because first of all, they're not easy topics to talk about. Design is actually one of those things that it's very hard to really teach someone, in my opinion. And a lot of it, and even when it comes to color, I find that from my own experience, when I try to really intellectualize it in terms of really thinking about it without actually doing, it's very hard to understand. And I think both have to go hand in hand, where you learn about theories, but at the same time, and even more importantly, is to actually just have that mileage, you know, and things will like patterns will start to emerge as you start doing more of it.
Yeah.
And
it's really just slowly growing. It's I feel like well, it could also just be the way I learned that it's never been very, very much goal oriented. It has been pretty much all right. That's so many things to tackle. You just start at some point at something and then work yourself through it, and then you move on to the next thing. And all of a sudden you realize, hey, 4 years have passed and you are now decent at drawing. Crazy.
You're not decent.
But I find a lot of value in having these kinds of discussions. And I personally am the kind of person that really enjoys trying to be able to break it down to something that's teachable. So even having these discussions helps me sort out my own thoughts, helps me to realize what other people struggle with, and also how other people approach it. So I really do hope that this discussion has been helpful to you guys that have been listening.
Yeah.
Damn, that's one hell of a mind map that Silent made.
Oh wait, where?
Oh Jesus! Damn, what?
Silent. Oh shoot! Awesome.
Really good.
Yeah.
Yeah. But if for those of you that didn't make your own notes, I've also been doing it as well, and I've been streaming it too. So and I've also recorded the whole session earlier, and I will do an edit to it similar to what I did for Axel's demo last time. So if you've missed it, you can always just listen back to it. But yeah, I think with that said though, I think it'll be good to wrap it up, guys. And I really appreciate the people in the chat for asking questions, and also to Cece for asking the question that ended up becoming today's topic. And of course, to Mathias and Axel for participating in the discussion as well. I personally learned a lot from what you guys had to share, and it was really interesting to see where we differ and where we share similarities.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. Cheers.
Of course. But yeah, does anyone have anything else they want to say or comment on before we wrap things up?
No, I'm good.
Yeah, I'm all good here too.
Will you share your notes?
Hell yeah, man. I will be doing that.
Sweet.
Hey, and hey, Harrison. Great to see you here.
Yeah, I've just been here listening to everybody, man.
Maybe we'll have you talk about colors, dude.
Yeah. Let's say too much shit.
That would be great, man. But yeah, with that said, thanks a lot, everyone, for joining in. And if you guys have suggestions for future topics that you would like to have discussed, then be sure to leave it in the suggestions thread, and I'll notify you guys when I finish editing the video, and also share the notes that I've been writing down very soon.
All right.
Thank you, guys. Time.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks a lot, everyone, and I'll be seeing you guys around the Discord and streams.
All right.
All right. Bye-bye, guys.
All right.
All right, take care, everyone.